Rick Harrison, the well-known face of the famous pawn shop reality TV show, had always been a symbol of success and business savvy. To most, he was a sharp, confident businessman who ran a thriving family-owned store. But behind the polished image, a shocking twist awaited that would completely turn his life upside down. It started with a moment of chaos, an unexpected incident that suddenly changed his entire world. One day, Rick found himself caught up in a series of events that led him straight into the cold, unforgiving reality of prison. The man who once effortlessly navigated the world of pawning and deals was now staring at the harsh walls of a prison cell. How did a successful entrepreneur end up behind bars? The question alone sparked an incredible curiosity, as no one could have predicted that this iconic figure would ever face such a fate. Inside those cold prison walls, Rick Harrison wasn't just a celebrity, he was a man who had to survive in a world that was foreign to everything he had ever known. The first day behind bars was a shock to his system, a world of steel bars, angry faces, and a constant undercurrent of danger. What went through his mind as the door clanged shut? What thoughts raced through his head as he realized his life was no longer his own? The suspense was palpable. Would Rick adapt to the prison world, or would it break him? As the hours turned to days, the pressure mounted. With every new face he encountered, he had to learn quickly. Trust wasn't given lightly in prison, and every move Rick made had to be carefully calculated. The fear of violence lurked around every corner, and it wasn't just the other inmates who were dangerous. Sometimes, it was the prison system itself. Each passing day added to the mystery of how someone like Rick, who had everything, could fall so far. What had led to this downfall? And more importantly, what secrets lay hidden in the dark corners of the prison system that would shape Rick's path? It became clear that Rick wasn't just facing a fight for survival, he was on a journey that would test his very character. What would happen to him in a place where everything he knew about life, business, and survival didn't apply? The uncertainty of it all was a constant cloud over Rick's head. Would he make it through this brutal reality, or was this the end of his story? The answers lay hidden in the shocking reality of Rick Harrison's time behind bars, a tale that promised far more than what anyone could have imagined. Rick Harrison's life had always been filled with certainty, until he found himself behind bars. The first few moments in prison were overwhelming, nothing like the calm control he had in the pawn shop. The sounds of the metal doors slamming shut, the rough voices of the other inmates, and the coldness of the concrete walls hit him hard. This wasn't the world he knew. How had he gone from a successful businessman to a man trapped in this brutal new reality? The prison wasn't just a physical place, it was a mental and emotional battle as well. The confusion Rick felt at first turned into a realization that survival here would require more than just business savvy. He needed to learn how to navigate the unwritten rules of the prison system. Every day was a game of risk, whether it was deciding whom to trust, what to say, or where to stand. In this environment, one mistake could cost him everything, and even the smallest misstep could lead to violent consequences. But there was something else gnawing at him. Rick couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than met the eye. What had caused him to be locked up in the first place? The details of his arrest seemed to be a blur, and he couldn't help but wonder if there were forces at play behind the scenes that were still unknown to him. Was he truly guilty, or was he part of something much larger than he had realized? As the days passed, Rick started to pick up on things around him. He noticed the strange looks from certain prisoners, the hushed conversations in the corners of the yard, and the way some people seemed to know things about him, things that shouldn't have been common knowledge. The sense of being watched never left him. It was as though the entire prison had a secret, one that wasn't just about Rick's situation but something deeper, something hidden in plain sight. Was there a reason he was here, or was he just another pawn in a much bigger game? These thoughts played on his mind, adding to the weight of the experience. Every day in prison felt like a puzzle he had to solve without all the pieces. The suspense built inside him, knowing there were answers out there but not knowing where to look or who to trust. Rick realized he couldn't just sit back and accept the situation. He had to dig deeper, find out who was really behind his downfall, and what kind of network he had unknowingly walked into. With every new encounter, he felt himself being pulled deeper into a world he never expected to be a part of. There was more to his time behind bars than simple survival. It was about uncovering the truth, even if it meant facing things that were darker than he ever imagined. Would he be able to find the answers, or would he be swallowed by the prison's secrets? The suspense and mystery only grew as he navigated this dangerous world, unsure of what would come next. As the days went on, Rick Harrison began to realize that prison wasn't just about staying out of trouble. It was about survival in its purest form. He had always been able to rely on his sharp business sense, but here, in this new and dangerous world, that didn't count for much. The prison was filled with rules he had never learned, and to survive, he would need to adapt quickly. The first few weeks were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Every moment was filled with new challenges, from figuring out who he could trust to avoiding potential threats from the more dangerous inmates. Rick soon understood that in prison, everything was a test. He couldn't let his guard down for even a second. But beyond the daily struggle for survival, something darker began to unfold. There were talks between prisoners that Rick couldn't fully understand, but the tone in their voices made him feel like he was in the middle of something much bigger than just a simple prison sentence. He overheard bits and pieces of conversations that hinted at hidden agendas, power struggles, and connections that stretched far beyond the walls of the prison. It was clear that the people around him weren't just inmates, they were players in a much larger game, and Rick had somehow become part of it. The curiosity grew as Rick started to piece together small fragments of information. There were certain people who seemed to be watching him more closely than others. Some gave him advice, while others kept their distance. The feeling that something wasn't quite right lingered in his mind. Why was he in this particular prison? Was there more to his arrest than he had been told? And what were the real reasons behind his downfall? Every day Rick felt the weight of these questions, and the more he learned, the more the pieces didn't add up. The suspense was unbearable as he realized that he wasn't just a victim of bad luck or a simple mistake. There were other forces at play, pulling the strings behind the scenes. Could someone have orchestrated this? Were the charges against him part of a bigger plan? Rick found himself caught in a dangerous game, one where the stakes were much higher than his freedom. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out to use him, to keep him in the dark about the truth. He wanted to uncover the answers, but he also knew that the deeper he dug, the more perilous his situation would become. Could he trust anyone here, or was everyone hiding something? As Rick navigated the prison world, he couldn't help but wonder if he had unknowingly walked into a trap. The more he tried to figure it out, the more tangled the mystery became. What he thought was just an unfortunate turn of events might actually be a calculated move in a much larger game. With every passing day, Rick found himself getting closer to the truth, and closer to the dangerous people who had been pulling the strings. The suspense and tension grew, and Rick knew that once he uncovered the truth, there would be no going back. Would he make it out of this alive? Only time would tell. As Rick Harrison continued to spend more time behind bars, his once clear view of the world began to distort. The prison, which had initially felt like an impossible nightmare, had started to become a strange reality that he had to figure out how to survive. He wasn't just dealing with the fear of violent inmates or the daily grind of prison life. There was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. The longer he stayed, the more he began to notice things that didn't sit right with him. He began overhearing strange conversations and sensing that there were a lot of people here who weren't what they seemed. For the first time in his life, Rick felt completely out of control, and that feeling of helplessness gnawed at him. What was really going on in this prison? Why were certain inmates paying so much attention to him? At first, Rick brushed off these oddities. Maybe it was just paranoia from the stress of the situation, but deep down, he knew something was off. He started asking questions, but each answer seemed to raise more questions, pulling him deeper into a web he didn't understand. He couldn't shake the feeling that his prison sentence was not as straightforward as it seemed. Was he just another man who had made a bad choice, or was there something more behind his conviction? As Rick began to dig deeper, the answers he uncovered only made the mystery more complex. The guards, the inmates, even the system itself seemed to be part of a larger hidden plan. Each day brought new fragments of information, stories from fellow prisoners, small clues hidden in conversations, and moments when people seemed to know more than they should about his past. Could the charges against him have been part of something more calculated? Was someone pulling the strings behind the scenes, setting him up for a fall? The deeper Rick looked into his own case, the more he realized that there were far-reaching connections and strange events linked to his arrest. The pieces didn't fit, and every time he thought he had a lead, it slipped out of his grasp, like a puzzle he could never quite solve. But it wasn't just the mystery of his conviction that bothered him. There was a larger, more dangerous question hanging over him. Why were these people paying so much attention to him? As Rick interacted more with his fellow inmates, he began to notice certain individuals who seemed to have far more influence than they should. These weren't the typical criminals that Rick had expected to find in prison. Some were well connected, and others seemed to know far more about the outside world than they let on. They were playing a game, and Rick was caught in the middle of it. But what game was it? Was it just about power and control? Or was there something even more dangerous going on behind closed doors? Every day in prison felt like a battle for information. Rick couldn't trust anyone completely, yet he had to rely on others to survive. He struck deals with people who seemed to know the ins and outs of prison life. He took risks, trying to learn more about the system, about the real reasons behind his imprisonment, and about the strange forces that seemed to be watching him. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was beginning to piece together something much bigger. The more he learned, the more he realized that the stakes were higher than he could ever have imagined. He wasn't just fighting to get out of prison, he was fighting to uncover a truth that could change everything. But with each new piece of the puzzle, the danger around him grew. The feeling that someone or something was watching his every move was constant. Rick knew he was being manipulated, but by whom and for what purpose? The tension in the prison grew as Rick uncovered more and more clues, each one pointing to something darker, something more hidden. His time in prison wasn't just a punishment, it was a test, and the questions kept piling up. What had his father really been involved in? What secrets had he kept hidden from Rick all these years? Was his family connected to something much bigger, more dangerous than he ever could have imagined? With each new realization, the weight of the situation became heavier. Rick wasn't just dealing with the harsh conditions of prison life, he was caught up in a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the walls of the prison. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that his time behind bars wasn't a simple mistake or a random twist of fate. It was a part of something much larger, a plan he was now part of whether he liked it or not. And the deeper he dug, the more questions arose. Was he part of a hidden network of power? Could he trust anyone inside the prison? Or was everyone playing their own game? The suspense built inside Rick every day, and the closer he got to the truth, the more he realized that escaping prison might not be enough. He had to find the answers before it was too late, but with every lead he followed, the stakes became higher, and the danger grew more intense. Would Rick be able to uncover the truth and escape the dangerous web he found himself in, or would the mystery consume him entirely? As Rick Harrison spent more time in prison, the sense of unease that had been building in him only grew stronger. The feeling that something wasn't quite right was no longer just a passing thought, it was now an overwhelming sensation. The prison wasn't just a place for criminals to serve their time, it was a complex and dangerous world where every move had consequences, and every word spoken could have a hidden meaning. Rick started noticing patterns, things he hadn't paid attention to before. Certain inmates seemed to be running the show, and they weren't just ordinary criminals. They were people with connections, with power, and with a deeper knowledge of the world outside prison walls. It wasn't just about survival anymore. Rick began to feel like he had stumbled into something much bigger than himself, something he wasn't prepared for. The constant surveillance, the hushed conversations, the strange alliances, it was clear that there was a game being played here, but Rick couldn't figure out who was pulling the strings. The more he observed, the more he realized that his own arrest and imprisonment weren't just a random event. There was a reason he was here, and it had nothing to do with what he had been told. He began to dig deeper into his case, looking for answers to questions he never thought to ask before. Who had really set him up? Why was he being targeted? As Rick began to ask these questions, he realized that no one was willing to give him a straight answer. Every attempt to get information led him to more confusion and more suspicion. Some inmates seemed eager to share details, but their stories didn't match up. Others were more cryptic, offering strange hints and warnings that left Rick feeling more uncertain than ever. The suspense of it all grew with each passing day. The deeper Rick delved into his own case, the more he uncovered, but nothing made sense. The pieces of the puzzle seemed to be scattered, and every time he thought he had a clear picture, another piece would shift, making everything more complicated. What seemed like a simple case of a man in the wrong place at the wrong time began to feel like a carefully orchestrated plan. Someone had set him up, but who? And why? Rick started to realize that there were forces at work that were far beyond anything he had imagined. It wasn't just about revenge or betrayal, it was about power, control, and manipulation. The prison itself seemed to be a microcosm of a much larger game, and Rick was now a part of it. But what was the end game? What were these people after, and what role did Rick play in it? The more Rick learned, the more questions arose. Every day brought new clues, but also more confusion. He had to tread carefully, because trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Even the smallest mistake could lead to disaster. The stakes were higher than ever, and Rick knew that the answers he was looking for weren't going to come easily. As time passed, Rick started to piece together a frightening truth. There was something bigger going on, something that had been carefully hidden from him for years. The people in the prison, the strange alliances, and the cryptic warnings all pointed to one thing. Rick wasn't just an innocent bystander caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a key player in a much larger story, a story that he hadn't even begun to understand. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore. He was fighting for his life. The forces that had put him in prison weren't just going to let him go, they had a much larger agenda. Rick began to feel the weight of it all, the danger closing in around him with every passing day. Every move he made, every conversation he had, felt like it was being watched, like someone was waiting for him to slip up, but he couldn't stop now. The truth was out there buried beneath layers of deception, and Rick knew that if he didn't keep digging, he would never get the answers he needed. The tension in the prison grew, and the stakes became higher than ever. Rick was no longer just trying to survive, he was trying to uncover a truth that could change everything. Would he be able to find the answers before it was too late? Or would the web of lies and manipulation tighten around him until there was no way out? The suspense was unbearable, and Rick knew that every day that passed brought him closer to a confrontation with the truth, or with the people who had orchestrated his downfall. What would he discover next, and how far would he have to go to survive? The questions continued to swirl around him, and the uncertainty became almost unbearable. But Rick knew one thing for sure: he couldn't stop now. The truth was out there waiting to be uncovered, and Rick was determined to find it, no matter what the cost. As Rick Harrison's time in prison continued, the situation became even more complicated and dangerous. The more he learned, the more he realized that his imprisonment was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. He had started out feeling like a man trapped in a nightmare, but now, with each passing day, he began to understand that the nightmare had layers he never even considered. The things that had seemed odd at first, the strange looks from some of the prisoners, the whispers that seemed to follow him, were all starting to make sense. Rick was no longer just an ordinary inmate, he was a pawn in a much bigger game. The deeper he dug into his case, the more secrets began to surface. It became clear that Rick wasn't the only one in the dark. The prison itself seemed to be full of people with hidden motives, and the more Rick uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Every step he took toward the truth felt like it was leading him closer to a confrontation with someone or something that had been carefully pulling the strings all along. The mystery surrounding his arrest began to grow, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger every day. There were moments when Rick thought he could finally see a way out, but every time he thought he had answers, they would slip through his fingers. The people around him seemed to be involved in something much larger than anything he could have imagined. It was like he had stumbled into a web of secrets that stretched far beyond the prison walls, and Rick had no choice but to follow the threads wherever they led, no matter how dangerous the path became. The uncertainty of it all weighed on him heavily. Rick wasn't just fighting to clear his name, he was fighting to understand why everything had gone wrong in the first place. Why was he targeted? What had he done to deserve this? And most importantly, who was behind it all? These questions consumed him, and as he pushed forward, the risk of finding the truth only grew. In prison, knowledge is power, and the more Rick learned, the more dangerous the people around him became. Some inmates were willing to help, but others seemed determined to keep him in the dark. The fear of betrayal was constant. One wrong move could send him further into the heart of the mystery, and Rick had to decide who he could trust, if anyone. The deeper he got, the more he realized that the prison wasn't just a place to serve time, it was a crossroads, a place where dangerous people came together to play a game that involved more than just money or power. It was about control, about making sure certain things stayed hidden. The truth was out there, but Rick had no idea how far he would have to go to uncover it. It became a battle between surviving the present and finding out what had truly happened to him. Each day the stakes got higher. The mystery around Rick's imprisonment became more layered, more complex. It wasn't just about his personal fate anymore, it was about uncovering the hidden world that had led him here. The more he learned, the more it became clear that there were forces at work that had been manipulating him from the beginning. What had seemed like a series of random events was starting to feel like part of a well-thought-out plan, and the question that Rick couldn't shake from his mind was why him? Why had he been chosen as a pawn in this game? Every conversation, every new lead, only deepened the mystery. The sense of being watched never left him. It felt as if someone, somewhere, was always one step ahead, carefully making sure that Rick didn't find out too much too soon. Every clue he uncovered was like a piece of a massive jigsaw puzzle that was missing key elements. It was like a game where the rules kept changing, and Rick had to keep playing without understanding the full picture. The closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. There were moments when he felt like he was on the brink of discovering something huge, only to have it slip away just out of reach. The more Rick pushed for answers, the more he realized that his battle for survival was not just against the prison system, but against the very people who had set him up. The suspense was unbearable. The clock was ticking, and Rick knew that with each passing day, the chances of him finding the truth before it was too late were slipping away. Every conversation felt like a risk. Every person he spoke to could either be a potential ally or a dangerous foe. It was like walking a tightrope, trying to stay balanced while the world around him seemed to shift and change at every turn. What had started as a simple desire for survival had turned into a race against time to uncover the truth and escape the dangerous web he had been caught in. Rick didn't know how much longer he could keep going without answers, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to stop. The curiosity, the need to know the truth, was too strong. The question remained: would Rick uncover the full story before it was too late, or would the forces working against him make sure he never found out what really happened?